You're a qualified counsellor and you feel ready to take that next step. Counselling Tutor's Advanced Certificate in Clinical Supervision, including online and telephone working. Built for the busy counsellor, the course starts with self-directed learning inside the custom-built learning portal. The theory then comes to life in live tutor-led sessions where it's demonstrated and explained. And you get to practice it yourself with peers with observation and feedback from the tutors. This training is mapped to the BACP Supervision Competence Framework and is NCPS quality checked. Visit counsellingtutor.com, click on the Products tab, and select Clinical Supervision Training to download your information pack and course handbook.
Hello and welcome to episode 376 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Amy Peters from New Glade Counselling. Amy runs a small team of neurodivergent therapists who work primarily with autistic and ADHD children and adults, offering one-to-one counselling, parent support and clinical supervision. Today, Amy joins us to talk about her new book, Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy, Rethinking Approaches for Autistic and ADHD Clients, a book that invites us to think more deeply about how we work with neurodivergent clients and how we can offer support in ways that are more affirming, more informed and more responsive to their lived experience. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome. This is episode 376 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly. Rory and I taking you on a journey of 3 stops today, starting with ethical sustainable practice, where we continue the discussion of AI. And today we're going to be speaking about AI in counselling practice, understanding consent around data protection. It's very, very important. It's a topic that is not fully understood. We'll dive into that one. Then we're going to practice matters where, excitedly, Rory has already teed this up. Amy Peters is going to be speaking about her new book, Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy. Stick around for that important topic. And then we're going to student services, where today, can your therapist be your counselling supervisor? And there's not a clear-cut answer on that. So it's going to be an interesting chat when we get to that topic in student services. But we're going to kick off, Rory, as always, with ethical sustainable practice. AI in counselling practice, that's our topic. We've been speaking about it for a few weeks because it is here, it is upon us. We're called upon by our ethical body to look at this. The laws are changing around us. And today we're going to be speaking about understanding consent and the use of data. What do we mean by that, Rory?
Well, what we mean, I think, is that when we're asking our clients to use maybe an app or something like that, we're not just saying, oh, it'll be good for you and tick that box. What we're saying is they have to have informed consent. And informed consent means that they must have an understanding of what the app does, and also where their data stored, and I think crucially, Ken, how they can reverse out of it. So if they don't want to use it anymore, can they reverse out of it, click delete, and their data's deleted? And I think it's really, really important that every therapist understands that informed consent is a little bit more than just saying, just tick this box. It means the person has to have an understanding. And part of that understanding, I think, Ken, is that the therapist may need to explain what the app does or what the service does, and also how the person can delete their data at the end of it. So be able to understand, be able to teach, if you like, the client what it is, what it does, so the client can make an informed consent. And I think we might touch on this as we go through this piece. If you're working with clients who have maybe memory loss or maybe neurodivergent, I think that equals a more careful approach.
Yeah. Oh, and beautifully introduced, Rory. And I think it's a misunderstood area, this. So we are covering the topic of AI, but informed consent is bigger than AI. The ICO calls upon informed consent, from the moment that somebody gets in contact with you. So here's the thing. Data, your client, your prospective client, if they're contacting you online, let's say they go to your website and they're having a look and they love what they see and they think, you know what, I want to get in contact with this person. Maybe you've got a little form on your website that they can click and they can put in their name and their email address and they can maybe send a little message to you. Well, where is their name and their email going? And where is that message that they are sending you going? Are you requesting informed consent at that front door? So any data, anything, whether it's a telephone number, a name, an email address, or an address, a physical address of a client is their data. And if we hold it or use it in any way, we need to have permission. We need to have informed consent. 2 words. Consent, we understand. It's an agreement that we can use it. But the informed bit is the important part that we're going to be focusing on here today. And informed means that client fully understands, they've been informed how their data is kept, where it is being kept, who can see it, how long it's been kept for. And if you want to understand data protection, go back to our last episode, 374. We spoke in depth around us understanding that. This is about how we explain this to our clients. And then, more importantly than that, how we evidence that we have done so. So if there is a challenge, if there is a data leak, if somebody comes back and says, I didn't give you permission, how do you say, here's my evidence. This is my evidence that I gave you informed consent. Now, as an example, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, that's our website. We speak about it all the time. And we always say, go to the podcast tab. And today we're going to say later on in this episode, go to episode 375. And there's a informed consent download that you can download. Now, this informed consent download that you can download, you're going to need to put in your email address so we can send it to you. And we're going to ask you what your name is so we can send it to you and say, hi, Rory, here is your download. But have a look on that little form and you'll see there's a little box. And it's an informed consent box that you have to tick. And it won't actually give you the download unless you tick that little box and say, I have understood why I'm giving my email and what it is used for. And underneath that informed consent box is how we use that information with a link through to our privacy policy that goes in depth in how that information is stored, where it is stored, etc., etc. So that is informed consent, or an overview of what it is. It is freely given that the client has genuine choice about their data and where it is used, because it belongs to them, of course. It is specific in that they know exactly how and where their data is going and how it is going to be protected. That it is informed, the client is informed. That means they understand it. We haven't just had a conversation that and said a whole lot of technical stuff. They understand it, and it is unambiguous. So there's no chance that the person doesn't fully understand it. It's expressed through a clear, affirmative act that we kind of enter into with the client, not just a pre-ticked box when they get to your website, that they actually need to do it themselves. It's unambiguous. They are giving that informed consent. Now, the reason we put this in, so it's not just around AI, it's any data we collect, and it sits under the ICO. But the ICO has got a quote, and I'm going to read it. It's from their website, and it says, it can be difficult to ensure you collect valid consent for more complicated process operations, such as those involved in AI. The more things you want to do with the data, the more difficult it is to ensure that consent is genuinely specified and informed. So it's a tricky area, Rory, isn't it? It's definitely something we need to consider of how we go about this. And you kind of alluded to this, Rory, just before I hand over to you. You're going to have this conversation right in the beginning of therapy. Maybe on your website, you're going to have privacy policy that's going to explain how you keep data. You're going to ask them to read that and tick that they've read that and agreed to that. You might even pop it in your contract and say, any data that you share, this is how we handle it in accordance with my privacy policy. Here's a copy of that for you as the client so that they fully understand what their data is being used for, Rory.
Yeah, beautifully outlined there, Ken. And I think the first position when you come to talking about informed consent is asking yourself a very simple question. Can I explain what the tool does or whatever I'm asking for informed consent for in plain language? And I always say to people, explain it to me like I'm 6, because that way I fully understand. If something's complicated, it's really important to be able to explain it in a way that people understand. And you should be able to describe clearly, say, for instance, using an AI tool, what the tool is for, so what the benefit of it is to the client, what information it collects, what happens to the information, who has access to it, how long is that information or data kept, or whether the data is used for anything beyond the immediate interaction. And I'm going to explain that to myself like I'm 6 now, Ken, because here we go.
Like that.
Right. I'm going to explain it as if I'm talking to Isabella, my granddaughter, who will be 6 very soon. The long and short of it is that when you share your data, your name and address, your telephone number, personal information, there's an expectation that the only person who you share it with is the person you shared it with. So if I shared it with Ken, there'd be an expectation that Ken would be the only person who had that information, wouldn't share it with anybody else. But when it comes to using apps, you have to be very, very careful that that app doesn't share the data with other people. And why is that important? Well, it's important because in the world we live in, data's a commodity. It's bought and sold like potatoes and carrots and yams. It's bought and sold, and it's a very valuable commodity. So when you're using any kind of interface that stores your data, you really need to be confident that that data only resides with the person you've given it to or the app you've given it to, and isn't aggregated or shared anywhere else. And I think the best place for that is in their data privacy policy. And you can find it with any reliable organization, such as Counselling Tutor. You'll find how we share information in our privacy policy. So it's really important you're able to understand the difference between sharing the information with the service that you're sharing it with and it being shared by the service to third parties. And if you can't explain this simply, the client may not be able to understand it as well, and enough, I think, to be able to give consent. And also, at all times, we should have real control over our data. And a meaningful consent also includes changing your mind. So I think that's something for everybody. We all use applications that store our data. But can you withdraw the consent later? Can you say, no, I'm not happy with the data being stored there? And, the application saying, fine, we'll just delete it. We'll pretend you've never been here. Can you access the data held about yourself or the client? What data is being held? Also, one of the biggest things is request changes to inaccurate information. So, as someone who's used the health service for many years, I have to say that occasionally I've gone in and said, you've got my name. I've got a very tricky name to spell, Lees Oaks. And sometimes it's spelt without the hyphen. Sometimes it's spelt with one E. Sometimes the Oaks doesn't have an E in it. And I can phone or email someone and say, look, that isn't my name. I'd like my name properly formatted, please. And also ask for data to be deleted. And what this adds up to is a consent checkbox at sign up really isn't enough. If there's no realistic way for the client to manage or remove their data afterwards. And this is only the thinking when we come to adults, but it's a different layer of thinking when we come to children, isn't it, Ken?
It is, yeah. When we're speaking about children, we're speaking about capacity in young children. Can it be easily understood? And I think you did a beautiful job of explaining it like a 6-year-old, Rory, which is exactly that. You know, I also like that you mentioned that it's not a moment in time informed consent. It's a process. It will continue throughout the arc of therapy. It is always an open door to be revisited, and the client needs to be aware that they can revisit it. And you might be saying, well, I don't give any apps to my clients, I don't give them anything, so I don't have to worry about this. But we do, because we're collecting clients' data, whether it be in our emails. How do you take your notes? Maybe you subscribe and use a note-taking app that is for counselors and psychotherapists, and maybe that is even beautifully protected. We spoke a few weeks ago about some of the apps are really comprehensive. They comply with data protection. But if you think about it, if you're using that application, you're going in and you may be putting in your client's name. You may be putting their emergency contact details. You may be writing notes about how they present. You may be taking their documentation that they may have shared with you. You may have an assessment that you've placed in there. You may have a referral letter from another agency. You may have some history on them, so their mental health history or their medical history, medications that they are taking on. As we've already shared, that is protected data. And even if that is the most secure application in the world, and you're 100% confident that none of that data is going to leak out, your client still needs to give informed consent. So you would need to say, when engaging that client, this is what I use for taking my notes. This is who it is. This is the agreements with them. This is the data processing agreement I have with them. We covered that in last episode 374. This is how they protect. I trust this, and I just wanted to make sure you were okay with me using this note-taking or practice management application in our therapy together. And they have a right to say no. They also have a right on 3 sessions time to go, you know what, I've been thinking about you taking my notes and I don't want you putting them in that application anymore. So that it's an ongoing relationship. And there's an example of how that informed consent might pop up. It's about anything we give the client to look at. And, this includes things like, let's say I'm going to meet with my client and I've decided that Zoom is what I'm going to use. I'm seeing this client remotely. If I say to my client, go and sign up for Zoom so that we can meet, well, we're telling them to go and use an app. We're saying, go over there, put your name and email address in and share it with somebody else. We're asking them to do that in order to engage in therapy with us. So you would have maybe an information sheet about what Zoom is and how they protect your data, a link to their privacy policy, so that we're informing, we're helping our client understand what it is that they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're protected, or in some cases, what the vulnerabilities may be of that. So, for example, Zoom is a for-profit company, even though you can have a free account, and the data is stored in the United States of America, so it's not covered by UK GDPR, but you're only sharing your name and email address, so it's very few details. We might put something like that in an information sheet for a client. If you're listening to this and going, oh, this is terribly complex and I don't want to know about all this stuff, it's raising my anxiety levels, stick with this podcast, because we're going to, in future episodes, speak about the privacy policy, your privacy policy in your practice, and we're going to show you how to put it together in simple terms, all the headings you need to be thinking about, and where you can get the information without being legally minded or understanding data protection in great detail. We're going to show you a simple way of doing that. So we've said that consent is a process. It's not a moment in time. It is you revisit it all the time. There is the right to be forgotten. That is a option. In counseling and psychotherapy, if you think about it, we keep our notes and we keep the client's details for a certain amount of time based on the laws and also our ethical bodies. What do you do if a client says, I don't want you to have any of my details anymore? Well, this is session 5 and I want you to delete it all. I don't want any mention of me in your records. That's I guess, an ethical challenge there. You'd need to balance your requirements by law to hold details for a certain amount of time with that client's right to be forgotten. And that's a great thing to kind of speak to peers and supervisors about. Rory handed over to me, thank you, Rory, about capacity, young people. And it's, age-appropriate explanations. If you are working with young people, how do you explain it in a way that they might understand it? So a 13-year-old client that you may be explaining how you take notes and where that is kept, are they able to understand that? Are we able to cut out all the jargon, all the complex talk, and make that really simple and easy to understand for them? And that contracting conversation, I think this is really important. This is the kind of conversation we're having before we start therapy, because by the time we start therapy, we already have the name, maybe an assessment form, we've got a lot of details. So it's a great opportunity to revisit your initial contract and mention this within that. The limitations and risks of AI for emotional support, we've already said you might be putting that into your contracting. That's, I guess, informing your clients if they choose to consent to use an app outside of your therapy, like go on ChatGPT and explore their own challenges there. And of course, we give that invitation for the client to revisit this anytime within the therapeutic journey, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also say that, if you're reading this and you're thinking, so much to do, I'd signed up to be a therapist, not a lawyer. We're all in the same boat. If Ken and myself are in the same boat as the therapist who works, down the road from us, because this is the brave new world of data protection. When we started, it was very, very different. When Ken and myself started as practitioners, it was very different. But as data is now becoming a kind of commodity to be bought and sold like potatoes or yams, protection needs to be put in place to make sure clients' sensitive information doesn't end up sold on to a third party. Can you imagine client gets a phone call from someone saying, I believe you're in a bit of a difficulty at the moment, and we've just got some data to say we might be able to help you. Well, how did you get hold of that? Is my counsellor given that away? Well, probably not, but what can happen and what does happen is if you're using applications that share data, there's a real possibility that the data can be shared to a third party who may very well use it to try and sell something or canvas something. It's something we have to think about. And one final thought before we roll out of this is that ethical consent is a process, not a one-off event. So really, therapists need to keep up to date with the latest kind of updates of the law or the interpretation of the law. And I think the best place to go is the ICO website if you're in the UK, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, which is just down the road from me in Wimslow. Pretty local to me. Don't go there in person. They won't be very happy if you turned up and knocked on the door. don't just drive there and say, "I've got this problem. Can I see someone?" I think they're going, "No, you can't. You need to contact us through our website or our customer chat, or email, or however they're contacted." But if you're not sure, please ring them up. The times I've rung them up and they've been super helpful. They're not out to catch you out. They're not there to set traps. They're genuinely there to give you really good, up-to-date information and, in my experience, help you with your business. They're very, very business friendly. I use business with a very tiny b. If you're a practitioner and you're charging for your services, then technically you're in business. So they're very, very supportive. But no, don't go to Wimslow and turn up. I don't think they're very pleased.
Yeah, knocking on the door. They've got a great website. And as a therapist, if you're in private practice, certainly you will be a member of the ICO. You will have an ICO number. We've mentioned that on the podcast a few times. If you're not a member, really do yourself a favor. If you're holding any data, just go and register with the ICO. It's not terribly expensive. And as Rory have said, they've got great services. And they even invite phone calls as well. If you've really got a sticky situation, and we spoke about that right to be forgotten. That's a sticky situation earlier on in the podcast. That's something you might phone the ICO and say, what do I do in this situation? So that is kind of today's ethical, sustainable practice. We've got a handout, as we always do. It's a Rory super duper handout. Where do you get that? You go to counsellingtutor.com, you click on the podcast tab, you go to episode 376, click on the little box to download it, click the informed consent button. Look out for it when you go there, and that will be delivered to your inbox. And that is ethical, sustainable practice. And we now move on, Rory. And today we're moving on to our practice matters section. And you met up, of course, with Amy Peters about her new book, Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy. What can we expect from this?
You can expect a lot. And full disclosure here, Amy sent me a PDF, a kind of publisher's pre-release PDF for me to have a look at the book, and I think it's brilliant. As neurodivergence is growing and becoming more and more aware of it, there's more literature coming on the market, but this certainly is a book to have. I caught up with her, and this is what she said. Neurodivergent people are becoming more visible and recognised in society, which is a positive shift. For many years, autistic people, those with ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurodivergent ways of being were often misunderstood, overlooked, or judged against narrow ideas of what is considered normal. Today, there's a growing awareness that neurodivergence is not something to be fixed, but a different way of thinking, experience, and engaging the world. This is also becoming increasingly important in therapy, where neurodivergent clients may present in ways that do not always fit traditional expectations of communication, emotional expression, or relational style. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Amy Peters from New Glade Counselling, herself a neurodivergent therapist and author of her new book, Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy, Rethinking Approaches for Autistic and ADHD Clients. So Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi Rory, thanks so much for having me back. I'm really excited to talk to you today, actually.
Yes, I'm excited. And full disclosure, Amy has sent me a PDF copy of this book to have a look at, so that I can form my questions and get a really good understanding of what's been written. So thank you for sending that on. I've got a little pre-release copy. I feel like a proper interviewer now. So I guess my first question really is, what inspired you to write the book, Amy?
So I think for me, this book is the book that I really needed as I started seeing clients. I didn't feel prepared, I think, to support my neurodivergent clients fully. And it felt like there was quite a big gap between how we're trained as counsellors and what actually works for neurodivergent people. And as I saw more and more neurodivergent clients, I saw clients who had been maybe misunderstood, maybe subtly shamed for their ways of being by their counsellors, not intentionally at all, but I think in part because therapy models are still so rooted in neuronormative assumptions, those kind of unwritten standards that dictate how we're supposed to communicate or express ourselves. So I really wanted something to bridge that gap, really. The book hopefully bridges that gap. So it's a practical book, but it's also reflective. And it's something that hopefully helps therapists see difference through an affirming lens rather than a deficit one. And then also really the inspiration comes from certainly my clients, absolutely my clients, but also my own journey of self-discovery, realizing that I was autistic and ADHD. It's been such a huge paradigm shift for me and something I'd never considered for years, as I didn't come to this realization until I was in my late 30s. So that was really a catalyst for all of this, for wanting to write something that I could understand and that a way I could communicate the way that I work, really. So that's been a massive inspiration to me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is an inspirational book. And also I think it speaks to what we've mentioned on the podcast many times before, being a 21st century therapist. A lot of the theories that are taught are rooted in the 20th century, along with their assumptions of how people present, of what's acceptable communication or acceptable behaviour or acceptable gender. It's rooted in 20th century thinking, and of course we live in the 21st century, and with the 21st century, new theories, new ideas, new understandings emerge that the people who wrote the original theories had no idea about. It just wasn't evident to them. So I guess that leads me on to thinking this is a great book for therapists. In fact, we're going to recommend it for our training course on autism and neurodivergence, becoming a neurodivergence affirming therapist. But could it be useful? It struck me it might be useful for people in other professions and other walks of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote it primarily for therapists, from my perspective as a therapist, but the book in itself is really about that shift from seeing autism and ADHD as flawed, disordered things to seeing it in a much more neutral way. And it's about reframing autism and ADHD. And I think a lot of professions could benefit from that. And I think also parents and neurodivergent individuals might benefit from reflecting on that shift. And I think also, although I do talk about therapy in the book, a lot of the book is neurodivergent education, really, looking at neurodivergent traits and reframing them through that new kind of lens. So I think there's a lot of knowledge to gain from the book. I talk about emotional regulation, trauma, masking, sensory differences, justice sensitivity, all sorts of things that absolutely could be relevant for all sorts of professionals, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it struck me that I thought social workers, teachers, parents, HR professionals, people who work in human resources, or just interested members of the public may benefit from reading this, because to understand somebody, I think, is to make them feel seen in the world. And I speak for myself as someone who's neurodivergent, that for a long time I don't think I was seen in the world as who I am. And now that people have got a frame for it and they can say, well, that makes sense, it becomes a lot easier. And I guess it speaks to the word affirming, which sometimes I think gets a bit of a bad press. So what does neurodivergent affirming really mean?
Yeah, it's a good question, and probably quite hard to put into just a few words, but neurodivergent affirming really is an approach, or maybe you could even say it's like a mindset that recognises, respects, and certainly supports neurodivergent ways of being as valid forms of human diversity, really. So it aligns with the neurodiversity paradigm, which is the idea that neurodivergent people aren't broken or disordered, we're just different. So we start from that difference rather than a deficit. And then we're focusing on understanding the context around that and how we can support that person rather than trying to fix them, essentially. So it's moving away from that medical model idea of autism and ADHD, really. So I think that is the fundamental part of what neurodivergent affirming is. But then on top of that, for us as counsellors, I think this is an invitation to rethink the whole system. As you were saying about the different modalities we use, we need to go deeper. We need to reflect on what we might be missing. We need to critique those models and approaches that we use. So introducing concepts like intersectionality, which is vital to consider with this, working on our own internalized ableism as professionals, just to ensure we're not perpetuating those harmful stereotypes. So I think it goes, way further than that. And I hope my book kind of takes readers through that process.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible journey that comes off the page, and I think it speaks to. It speaks to the fact that there are many different ways of being. For those in the person-centered canon, I suppose a way of being is something that's often talked about. But I do wonder sometimes if there is sometimes a kind of border. Oh, well, it's a way of being as long as it's this way of being, and not your way of being. And I think, studying Rogers, I think Rogers would heartily agree, given the new information, And you do talk about in the book about traditional models sometimes pathologizing neurodivergent ways of being. Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think difference is often pathologized in those models. So we could take something like stimming, which is self-stimulatory behavior, but effectively we all stim, we all fidget, we all move, we might twirl our hair, or we might bite our nails or something like that. But for neurodivergent people, we often need to do it that much more to regulate ourselves. But I think sometimes using those kind of models or coming from that framework, that can be seen as something maybe to suppress as opposed to a regulation strategy. And some models might pathologize that stimming by reading more into it, kind of reading into the body language, as an example. I also think another example could be someone who's having a shutdown in therapy, perhaps might be viewed as avoidance. They're avoiding the subject, and therefore they're treated in a certain way in that environment. Whereas I think those are natural regulation responses. Maybe they're trauma responses also in some cases, but pathologizing them just increases the shame and that feeling of being othered, I think, which certainly doesn't help with self-compassion. So I think affirming practice kind of reframes them now as natural expression, as understandable responses, which is so important, I think, with our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like you've pointed to the fact that sometimes neurodiversity does, or theory, collides with neurodiversity. Things like when someone's shutting down, think of it, in psychoanalytic terms as escaping or avoidance, where it isn't that. It's the fact that someone's overloaded, literally overloaded, and emotions are overloaded. And also, I think I like the way in the conversation we're talking about ways of being. We talk about a way of being, but perhaps it would have been better if we stuck an S on the back of that and said it's ways of being. Yeah. And I guess that can lead to therapists making mistakes. What are the common mistakes that therapists may unconsciously, or I'm going to use the word ignorance in its purest sense, without knowing the information, make with neurodivergent clients?
Yeah, and I agree. It's usually an unconscious thing for sure. It's like those sort of buried assumptions that we don't even realize are there. But I think a big one is misinterpreting that behavior, like I was saying earlier about shutdowns, for example, and not recognizing that there can be different ways of communication or ways of processing, or like you say, ways of being, not recognizing that there's a different way than our own. Maybe assuming someone's disengaged because they're not making eye contact. That's quite a common one. When eye contact for neurodivergent people can often be distressing, uncomfortable, or even painful. Or maybe another common one is thinking that a client who talks loads or goes off on tangents in lots of different directions might be, again, avoiding something, where it's actually the way I know I process information like this. And maybe they feel, like me, a deep need to kind of set the context for the therapist to just avoid being misunderstood. But actually that it's seen as something different. So I think it's that kind of, the common mistake is that it's unintentionally reinforcing the idea that neurodivergent clients need to appear more neurotypical, or maybe they need to mask more. And as I say, that's probably intentional and can be really subtle. So it might be like using social skills training or sensory regulation, but framed around exposure and desensitization, rather than understanding the neurodivergent traits for what they are, really.
Yeah. And of course, there's been a big debate within the neurodivergent community, in terms of allowing people to be as they are or training them to fit in to be more neurotypical. And I think that's a concern, because I don't know about your book, but in my book, not to have written a book on this, but if I had written a book on this, I would have said we're bordering on conversion therapy when we're training people to fit in to the social norms that are acceptable or perceived as acceptable.
Absolutely. And I think as therapists, we wouldn't necessarily even know we're doing that, because it's so ingrained in us, because we've all grown up with these assumptions and neuronormative ideas of things. We've all grown up with that. So it's so ingrained. So we need to do the work to kind of unlearn that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no shame in holding one's hands up and saying, I didn't know that. I'm going to do some CPD on that. And of course, your book is an ideal started primer for the journey of understanding that. And I guess that, what you talk to people, if I talk to people that I meet in social circles, not that I meet many people socially, but if I did, I sometimes if I mention that I'm neurodivergent or I have autistic traits, people make really common assumptions about me, like I'm a genius, or that I can do this or I can do that. What are the common myths that people with ADHD and autistic traits have to endure, shall we say?
There are so many. A really interesting one is this sort of myth of that particularly autistic people have a lack of empathy. And it's something that I've heard a lot from counsellors, autistic counsellors actually, who have been kind of told that, you can't be a counsellor when they're starting out on that journey. You can't be a counsellor because you're autistic. You don't have enough empathy. Whereas actually that's absolutely not true. And I think there might be differences in the way empathy is experienced or expressed in autistic people. Yes. But it's absolutely a myth that there's a lack of empathy across the board. And of course, if you imagine a client, if we're assuming that they might struggle with empathy, whereas actually they're just expressing it in a different way, they might not show it on their face in the way we would expect. That's going to affect how we interact with them in a therapy room, I think. The other myth that I think is really important to address is a topical one for both autism and ADHD, around the idea that there is this massive overdiagnosis now and that people are jumping on the bandwagon. And I think it's really important to address that actually anyone who's been through the process of a diagnosis knows it's not an easy one. Huge waiting lists or huge price tags for private assessment means that it's prohibitive. A lot of people can't engage with that. There's a lot of barriers to access diagnosis. And actually, we've had historic underdiagnosis in lots of groups, particularly for women, for people of colour, for other marginalised groups. And historically, research into autism and ADHD hasn't centred a lot of people. It's focused on boys, largely white boys. So if you were somebody who didn't fall into those categories, you wouldn't have been recognised. as that. So now what we're finding is there are generations of people who were not recognised in childhood. And now that we understand a lot more about autism and ADHD, and there's a lot more public information about it, we've got people, of course, recognising themselves in the diagnostic criteria and coming forward for that diagnosis. So it's not an overdiagnosis, it's a historical underdiagnosis, then we're just playing catch up, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the point you make about men being classically diagnosed. You know, when I started to look at the literature, when I started to build the course that I made, one of the things that came up was it was only thought at the time that men, it was called a male brain, extreme male brain. And it was only white males that could have it, and all the usual stereotypical thinking around that. And, you know, I think the media didn't help. There was a film called Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, and everybody thought, oh, he's autistic. And it turns out he wasn't autistic. He had a different neurological development pathway. And also I think that it disadvantaged women greatly because I know from my own personal experience of a loved one that person had to go through a massive amount of therapy before somebody was sharp enough to say, might not be something that it's a therapy related thing. It might be something else. And that person went on to take a diagnosis, diagnosed as autistic. And there is a YouTuber called Rebecca Jane Brown, I think, and she's chronicled her journey, and it's appalling. She's had pills, she's had misdiagnosis, which hardly ever comes off your medical record, personality disorders, all this type of thing, and now finally she's got a diagnosis. But the other thing is the historic kind of injustice. Up until 2014, I think you weren't allowed to have either ADHD or autism. You had to have one or the other. Is that right?
It is, yeah, absolutely. You could only be diagnosed with one, and if you had that one diagnosis, you couldn't then go through the pathway for another. Yeah.
And now it's not unusual for people to have is it called a differential diagnosis or Yeah. So I think in terms of female experience, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think the road's been a bit harder than for us fellas, to be honest.
I think there's a huge amount of gaps for women generally in kind of in terms of health research, and this is a big one. And so, as I said, we're playing catch up, aren't we? So of course there's going to be more people recognizing themselves, suddenly having those kind of eureka moments, definitely, that like I did.
Absolutely. It's a brilliant book, and I think one that should be required reading for anybody who's a therapist. But I do think there's a wider audience for it: HR professionals, social workers, teachers. The list is endless. I'm doing my best to plug this as hard as I can for you, Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Rory.
So if there was just one key message that you hope that people would take away from the book, what would it be?
I think the key message I'd want them to take away is that neurodivergent affirming isn't just a tick box exercise, and this book isn't just a how-to manual or a set of techniques. Like, it does have practical tools in it that you need and you can take away and use them, but it's about that complete shift in perspective. And being neurodivergent affirming changes everything. So it has to change everything. So how we think about therapy, how we set up our spaces, how we communicate, how we interpret other people's communication, even down to how we structure our policies and our paperwork, really. So as I said before, it's an invitation to rethink that whole system, to depathologize our work. And I think that approach feels much more aligned with our goals as counsellors as well. I think those two things align. So when you see it through that lens, I don't think you can really go back. So I think that if they could take away something, it would be that it is a journey, and hopefully my book can help give you the confidence to guide you through that, really.
Yes, I'd heartily agree. Neurodivergent Affirming Therapy, Rethinking Approaches for Autistic and ADHD Clients is published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers and will be available on the 21st of May 2026 from your favourite book retailer. So it just remains for me to say, Amy Peters, thank you for joining us.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com. Massive thank you to Amy Peters and thank you to you, Rory, for holding those all-important discussions. And that is today's Practice Matters. And we move right now into student services, recognising you, students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, psychotherapist, or to gain the skills along the way. And today we're speaking about, can your therapist be your supervisor? I've heard this one before, Rory.
I know it's one that comes up. It's what we call evergreen. So I think the first position is that Ken and myself, and indeed Paul Cullen, who'll be joining us as our special correspondent on supervision in this conversation, will say that we're just peers. We're not giving you advice, but I think the first position to take is that we're all creatures of habit. I know I am. I go to the same tea room. I travel the same way to places. I think we become creatures of habit, and especially I think when we've had a difficult time in our life. So I'll give you an example of that. Say, for instance, you're walking down the road and you were attacked. You would probably avoid that road and go down a different road. And as you got more confidence in walking to wherever you're going, you probably stick with it. And I think that can happen if someone's had a difficult time and they've gone to a therapist and they've had a really good experience, and then they think, well, I want to train as a counsellor. So they do the courses, and then at one point there's the lesson that says you have to have a supervisor, you need to find a supervisor. I think for some, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I had a great experience with this counsellor who happens also to be a supervisor. So perhaps I'll have that person as my supervisor as well, because I trust them. I've trusted them before with my own kind of journey, and I'll continue my journey with this person. And it can be tricky. First of all, I don't think, and I'm pretty sure in this, is that if you're having therapy with someone, you could really have them as your counselling supervisor as well, because every ethical body talks about dual relationships. In other words, someone doing two jobs within the therapeutic canon, being your supervisor and being your therapist. And also, I think that counselling is about being challenged. Part of developing yourself as a counsellor is taking the road less travelled. I'm quoting a book by Scott Peck there. And that is, taking a few risks, being a bit uncomfortable. So to really milk the metaphor of the road that I used earlier on, perhaps you're used to going down a familiar road, but perhaps as your practitioner journey, it might be worth thinking of taking another one and finding a supervisor who isn't your therapist, because they are, as Paul will talk about, two different aspects of counselling. And I think training to be a therapist asks you to, be brave. And we know that you're only being brave when you're doing things that scare you. At least that's what I say to my granddaughter. Yeah.
I think that's fantastic advice, Rory. Yeah, it's an interesting one. This comes up again and again. My answer is it depends. So I default to exactly what you've said, Rory. We need to look at the role of a therapist. So when you go for your personal therapy or you're seeing a therapist, the role is that of therapist and client. And that's a very, very special held place. And it's maybe a place where you're going to share a lot of yourself. As a client, you're going in, you're speaking to a therapist, and very often, and you'll see this when you're in practice yourself, a client may share stuff with you that they have not even shared with their closest family. Now, I know from my own therapeutic journey, because I'll dip in from time to time when needs arise on that, and of course I did it during my training, I shared a lot with my therapists over the years that I would never dream of sharing with my supervisor. It's not relevant to share with my supervisor, because the role of supervisor, supervisee, so let's say I'm the supervisee in this role, it's not about me. It's about my practice and the clients that I'm seeing. I'm taking those to my supervisor. And yes, of course, I'm there in part. But if you think about it, and you find this out when you train to be a supervisor, very often, if there is a challenge in self, and I'm the supervisee and I go and see my supervisor will say, you should take personal therapy outside, go and see a personal therapist. And you'll go and do that separate to your supervision. Why? Because within supervision, you're not there to work on yourself. And there's where the confusion comes. If you've worked with somebody and you've worked on yourself with that person, going in and bringing your clients only can be challenging for you. But also for them, it may be challenging because they know you in a different way. They know a different side of you. So that can be tricky. Now, we said going in, and Paul agrees, and I'm glad that you said, Paul, Ken, Rory say the following. We're just peers having a discussion. There's not a right or wrong here. You need to make your own decisions on this. But there is a role conflict, definitely. Maybe if you saw that therapist 9 years ago, you saw them when you were when you were a student. Now you've been in practice for 10 years, and you liked their style, and you dip in and say, you know what, I really liked working with you back then. I wonder if you might be my supervisor. Maybe, and I'm just putting in a maybe there. It might be a little bit different if a lot of water has passed under the bridge, but certainly not having personal therapy and then going into practice and saying, hey, would you mind being my supervisor? Definite role conflict there. I think that I'm looking forward to hearing what Paul has to say about this, because he's had personal therapy, he's a supervisor himself, he undertakes supervision himself, and he trains on our supervising training course, Rory. So I guess he's got a lot more to share on this. So shall we head over and see what Paul has to say on this topic?
Yeah, I think it's a good time just to hand over to Paul. Ken and myself have talked about the dangers, or I guess the pitfalls of dual relationships. But what is your view on, from a supervisor's perspective, on if you had a client who came to you and said, I want to be one of your supervisees?
Well, good to see you, Rory. It's a question that has come up. It has come up previously. I've seen it mentioned on the Facebook group. And I think, as a supervisor, if I'm working, as someone's counsellor, and they're requesting me potentially for supervision, my first instinct would be to say, well, no, it's not going to work now because we're in a different kind of relationship. But I think the supervisor, needs to be, thinking about, well, why do you want me as your supervisor? What do you think is going to be beneficial in relation to this? And in sort of like preparation, thinking about this question, I was thinking as a supervisor, and I have had this come to me in the past. My first thought was, well, I need to go to my ethical body and have a look. What does my ethical body say about dual relationships? And we talk about this in the supervision course that we deliver. We have a section on dual relationships. And I was just looking at the presentation on what the different codes of practice say slightly different things. So if that's your initial first call, it's dependent on your own ethical body as to what they may say. BACP says needs to be avoided where the risk of harm to the client outweigh any benefits to the client. The NCPS is a little bit more clearer and says regarding supervision, all practitioners undertake to not engage in any dual relationships when seeking supervision. The UKCP says if a dual or multiple relationship is unavoidable, for example, in a small community, take responsibility for clarifying and managing boundaries. So you've got different stances or slightly different stances. And I think the other thing that I needed to do is, well, I need to talk to my supervisor. I need to discuss it with my supervisor.
Yeah, I absolutely go to your ethical bodies initially. And also, I think, speak with your supervisor. The other thing that would concern me is the kind of archiving of the relationship. Let me explain that. When you have a therapeutic relationship, when a client leaves that therapeutic relationship, how they remember it is really, really important, because in times of crisis, clients may very well look back onto the attachment style and the reparenting style that sometimes happens within therapy, where there's this kind of solid, dependable person that they've seen, which might be very, very different to the people they've had in their lives. And also, speaking, I guess, to the attachment style. Now, in therapy, that is really, really important, and it forms a curative factor. I know people who still remember their therapy journey and still go back to it many, many years later in their mind when things are tough. However, supervision is a different thing, and a supervisor isn't a therapist. A supervisor is a clinical overseer of someone's practice. And I think in terms of a student, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Paul, sometimes we need to be quite direct initially with students when they start, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that formative piece in. Yes, we're supportive, and yes, we're thoughtful, but it's that formative piece. In other words, helping them get the formulation of how they apply the skills, understand the theory, and that can be quite directive. And my thought here is it could be quite a shock to work with a therapist, have a very fond memory of them, and then go back and as that therapist as your supervisor to find that actually they're doing a different job. Yeah, and you're right. I think supervision can be quite directive, and that's certainly when I think about my own way of working as a supervisor, I can be quite directive, because there are a number of different issues. Like I said, there's a clinical overseer, there's a weight of responsibility. Within the training course, we try to differentiate the importance of recognizing that this is a completely different type. It's a different hat, is supervision. You're wearing a different hat, and that could be quite confusing if there has been a therapeutic relationship beforehand. When I, like I said, I'd been approached about this previously. And, when I had a conversation with my supervisor about it, and I said, this has happened, what do you think? And they said, well, there are a number of things to be kind of, considering. And that, there are a number of factors. The therapeutic relationship needs to have ended. How are you considered in that therapeutic relationship? How might that be enhanced or damaged if you were to enter into a supervision relationship? For example, and I think, it's considering all the different factors, the potential ethical issues that could arise. So a supervisor that you've had a therapeutic relationship comes to you, presents a client, and you have a very clear recollection of, from the therapeutic relationship, some similar issues. Let's say, for example, that they're presenting a client who's experienced a miscarriage. Now, from the therapeutic relationship that person has also experienced a miscarriage. Can you bring that up? Can you mention that? Because that is a therapeutic relationship that was contracted and has now ended, and there's confidentiality clause in there. And these are the kind of things that you need to consider that might potentially come up, and it would take a lot of navigation and clarity around these potential issues that might rise. Yeah, absolutely. And we're not saying that it's impossible to have, to have someone who was formerly a therapist as a supervisor. So if there is anybody listening who are in that position, we're not saying it's wrong or it's bad or there's an ethical question over it. But I think that both those individuals would have to really understand the boundary between therapy and supervision. And, when we talk in supervision, we talk about formative, normative and restorative.
Yeah.
Formative is information. So I always say that with students, supervision is the mortar between the bricks. You get the bricks laid in the classroom, but the mortar really that holds it all together, holds the structure together, is a combination of practice and supervision. So, you can say, yes, that's what the theory says, but actually, as you've seen, it looks like this. And that's how I guess, if I'm going to use the building analogy and kind of flog it to death, that's how strong counsellors are built. That's a terrible analogy, that, but it is the mortar between the bricks. And so that's the formative. The normative is the ethical sides of things, being ethical, looking at the general way someone's working with a client, turning up on time, contracting, that type of thing. And then there's a restorative element. And the restorative is when somebody comes in, a supervisor comes in, and they're doubting their skills, they're doubting themselves. They think, they're in a place where they think they're not being effective or doing it wrong, which is what students often say, doing it wrong. And there's a line, isn't there, between restorative, supporting somebody in their practice, helping them develop that professional formation, and then offering therapy. And I could see some mission creep there, as they say in the military, where it starts off with supporting someone and helping them understand that they're building their practice, and then sliding across that boundary into therapy, in which point the whole process is not about the client, it's about the supervisee.
Yeah. And again, the model that we teach, and that, the seven-eyed model of supervision has like distinct modes or eyes that focus on the different aspects of the therapeutic relationship. And part of that might come up, for example, when we're focusing on, the supervisee's process, and we might be looking at their past experiences, and that might bring up some of that therapeutic content, but it's not for me as a supervisor to then go into, I'm going to be your therapist in this moment. It might be that I might be bringing into the supervisee's awareness, there's something that needs to be kind of thought about here, and you might need to consider, looking at your own personal therapy, and that's kind of explore this, because this is potentially or is maybe currently getting in the way of the work with your own clients. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it needs to be fresh. I think that one of the joys or the beauties of supervision is that you can come in really fresh, have a fresh relationship, develop a way of working, and again I think that there's some modelling here. We've talked about what we call a reparenting style. It's not particularly person-centred. I'm borrowing from Petruska Clarkson's model here. Yeah. But, I think any person-centred therapist would say that modelling is a really important part of being a therapist.
Absolutely.
Certainly clients with difficult attachment styles or have difficult histories can see someone as a reliable person. I think that modelling's different if you're a supervisor. That modelling's different, because the focus, as you say, doesn't matter what model of supervision you practice, but the modelling really is on how to view your work. You're bringing your work, and as part of that work, you're bringing yourself, but the focus is on the work. Well, before we reverse out of here and go back to Ken in the studio, you got any final thoughts about what you might think if someone came to you and said, you're my therapist, I've had a few months break, but I'd like to be my supervisor?
I think the easiest answer is to acknowledge that that there are so many potential difficulties that might arise, and those that you might not be aware of, that if you can avoid it, then avoid it. And I would certainly say, as a supervisor, again, have a look at your ethical body, have a conversation with your supervisor and see what your supervisor says. But, there are a lot of up and coming and continued training and really well experienced supervisors out there. Shop around, it is your practice.
Yeah. I think those are wise words. Shop around, and it is your practice. And on those final pieces of wisdom, back to you, Ken, in the studio.
If you're studying counselling, the student library from Counselling Tutor is like having your own tutor alongside you. Every theory and skill in plain English, mapped to your specific course and level. Visit counsellingtutor.com, click on the products tab, and select Student Library for more information. That's counsellingtutor.com. Always a pleasure to hear from Paul Cullen, our roving reporter, on the topic of supervision especially. Thank you, Rory, for holding that discussion there. It's an interesting topic, and we hope that you got something from today's student services. And it's now time for me to say that this has been episode 375 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
It has. We started off with ethical and sustainable practice, where we talked about AI in counselling practice, understanding consent and data use. And as we mentioned in the discussion, it just doesn't cover AI, it covers any data use at all. And it might be worth me just plugging your new book, Ken. The information we're getting for these parts of the podcast come from Ethical AI in Practice for Counsellors and Psychotherapists in the UK.
Here's the book, Rory.
There it is. He's holding it up.
There it is. I'm holding it up.
There
this
it
is my
is.
author copy, so it's got the band across the side that says you can't sell it. But if you go to ethicalaipractice.com, which is a counselling tutor run website, you can get all the information of the book. The book is now available. Thanks for that plug, Rory. Appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem at all, Ken. Moving on from there, Practice Matters, interview with Amy Peters from New Glade Counselling, and talk about neurodivergent affirming therapy. An excellent book, and certainly one that we're going to recommend on the reading list of our autism practice course, autism awareness course, because it really, really is a good book. And then straight into student services. Can your therapist be your counselling supervisor? Ken and myself had a good chew of the cud over that. And indeed, we were joined by our correspondent, Paul Cullen. And maybe that will be food for thought in training rooms and discussions in class. As always, thank you for your likes, subscribes and shares. So until the next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got one that could do with an upgrade, WebHealer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners £100 off the cost of a website design and build. WebHealer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's all they do. Their team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution so that you can focus on your time with your clients. They've been doing this for over 20 years and are a trusted name amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. Get the full package details and claim your £100 off coupon at counsellingtutor.com/website.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.